This week on the Getting to Know Jew podcast, we talk with Abby Magariel. Since 2019, Magariel has been the curator and educator at the Michael Klein Collection at the Temple Congregation B'nai Jehudah. The collection has around 1,000 Jewish ritual objects that come from all around the world and many different centuries, which are used to teach people about Judaism. Let's just launch in with, for those who may not know, tell us, what is the Michael Klein Collection that you curate and what is its purpose?
The Michael Klein Collection is a collection of Judaica, so that encompasses Jewish art, Jewish ritual objects, and objects of Jewish material culture, the things that make up our day-to-day lives, all of the stuff of life. There are elements of all of those things in the Klein Collection. So that means we have pieces for holidays throughout the year, for objects that you'd find in a synagogue. We have objects that you could use in your day-to-day Jewish life and objects relevant to Jewish life cycle events. So the birth, wedding, B'nai mitzvah, death, all of these are explored in the Klein Collection. And it's a collection of over 1,200 objects, about a fifth of which are on permanent display here at B'nai Jehudah.
When you say 1,200, I know when the Kansas City Jewish Chronicle covered the collection in 2019, it was roundabout at 1,000 pieces. So it's grown since then?
Yeah, it is a growing collection. The collector, Michael Klein, he is a lifelong resident of Kansas City and a lifelong member at B'nai Jehudah. He is still very much in active collecting mode. So just today, I received a package in the mail of a new little Torah crown from the 18th century. We're really excited to get that put into our catalog and start using it for educational purposes.
Very cool. So when it comes to your role as a curator and an educator, can you tell us, how does handling a physical object help teach about and connect to Judaism? And I guess that's a question both for you, again, as an educator, but also for you as a person, because I'm guessing there's no way, handling this stuff doesn't affect you just as an individual as well.
When you put your hands on something, when you're holding it, it really connects you to that history. And you could be standing in front of it and be in the presence of something that means a lot to you as a Jewish person. And both of those experiences can be really rich, to be in the presence of something that has relevance to you or to your ancestors. It's an experience that is exciting when you are the person who is actively working with those things on a regular basis. Prior to coming to B'nai Jehudah, I worked in state and local history museums. So I was regularly using objects to learn about the spaces and the places and the people of recent history. And the objects in the Klein Collection come from all over the world. So although they may or may not have a specific tie to the Kansas City area, as Jews, we recognize the heritage of all of these objects, and we can understand how they were used. In the case of objects that are part of rituals or customs that we as American Jews or Midwestern Jews, we're not familiar with, I'm learning about new customs and new rituals all the time, things that I'd never come across before. And these are just different ways that Jews have been Jews throughout history. And so being in the presence and being able to hold and manipulate these objects it's a really special experience.
Give us a specific example. Like, what's the favorite, if you've got a favorite object or a favorite part of the collection, and why? Like, what, when you really sort of look at it and get to handle it, really, takes you to another level of understanding either Jewish existence or this object's history, like that kind of thing.
So we have a Hanukkah Menorah that it's not a unique piece. There are other museums and collections that have one of these pieces. There's one at the Smithsonian. There's one at the Skirball in Los Angeles. It's a Hanukkah Menorah that was designed by a man named Manfred Anson, who was a German teenager before World War II. He escaped Germany with the aid of an Australian aid organization, and later in life reunited with his family members who had survived, and became an American citizen and an artist. And among the things that he created were these menorahs for Hanukkah, one of which uses small casts of a Statue of Liberty figurine, like a little souvenir figurine of the Statue of Liberty, on the top of each of the branches of the menorah. Each of the branches, or each of the little statues below it, there's a little plaque naming a time that's of significance in Jewish history, a time when Jews escaped persecution, or a time when Jews were triumphant. And this eye-catching and beautiful, but also very simple menorah says a lot to us. It expresses the artist's pride in being both Jewish and becoming an American citizen. Anson was incredibly proud of becoming a citizen. And this menorah and another that he made that is similar, it uses, instead of the Statue of Liberty, it uses casts of the Liberty Bell on each of the arms of the menorah. But his pride is evident in the creation of this menorah. And it was created to commemorate the centennial of the Statue of Liberty in 1986. So there's a lot going on there. There's Jewish history, there's American history, there's American international relations, there's Holocaust history, and it's all wrapped up in one piece. So that's it's one of the newer pieces in the collection. We have pieces that date back centuries. There are pieces from Italy, which help us to understand when Jews were becoming citizens of the countries they were living in Europe. They were going through what was called emancipation in the 19th century. There are objects relating to, there's just, there's a lot to share.
So let's zoom out a little bit, because obviously, and I love this, you're a nerd for all of this, which is why you're doing it. And as a history nerd myself, I appreciate sort of the love for it. But what made you want to get into museum studies? At what point did you sort of go, yes, this is the world that I want to live in and that I want to keep exploring?
I've always been into history, and I love learning about the history of whatever place I'm living in or whatever place I'm studying. And when I was thinking about career paths, I said, well, I do enjoy history, but, that natural suggestion of becoming a history teacher, I knew that I didn't have it in me to be a classroom teacher. I have had some great classroom teachers in my schooling experiences, and I just knew that was not my calling. What I do love and what I have always loved are museums. And I love being in a space where everything is sharing and telling a history or telling a story of any sort using objects. I love telling a story with objects. And I think that having an experience where it's hands-on, which is something that we can do here with the Klein Collection that isn't always available with other museums, having that opportunity to work with objects makes history come alive and makes it a tangible experience rather than one that you just have to imagine.
So why end up where you are now, though, taking care of and building programming around a Jewish collection? To come back to something you mentioned before I hit the record button, you said this is sort of the most you've ever been involved in the Jewish community. You didn't really do any youth groups growing up. So why come to this now?
Before coming to B'nai Jehudah, I was working in state and local history. I worked at the State Museum of History, the Kansas Museum of History in Topeka for a number of years. And then I headed up the education program at the local history museum in Lawrence, Kansas. It's called the Watkins Museum. I highly recommend it to anybody who's going to Lawrence for the day. If you're dropping a kid off at KU or going to visit them, you should stop at the Watkins. It's a great place. I came to B'nai Jehudah because, well, it is a little bit of that Jewish geography coming into play here. So somebody I knew from my childhood, the parent of some of the kids in my religious school, she was a friend of my mom's, She is the former executive director here at B'nai Jehudah, recently retired, and she knew that I work in museums and that I work in museum education. She also was helping to complete this gift of the Klein Collection from Michael Klein to the congregation. And part of this gift was that Michael was endowing the position of an educator curator. So she had this position and she knew me. And she said, well, this might make sense. So she gave me a call and said, let's talk about this if you're interested. At that point, I was on a maternity leave. And so it was kind of a natural point for me to make a transition. So I came in, I learned about the Klein Collection, and it really felt like one of those meant to be pairings. Like this is Bashir. This is where we were supposed to be together. You know, I'm using this collection to learn and to teach about Judaism and Jewish history. And it's a great opportunity for me. And it's been fun to connect and reconnect with the Jewish community in Kansas City in a way that I wasn't ever really connected as a kid growing up in the same community.
Has it been, I'm trying to find the right way to ask this question, I don't know, challenging at all to sort of jump back into like the Jewish world and especially all of these artifacts, all the Jewish history, and kind of, because you as a educator, not just a curator, you kind of have to crash course both everything with the artifacts and then how to be able to teach about Judaism as well. Has that been kind of a difficult transition in any way, or an interesting transition?
Yeah, it's been an interesting and fun transition. When I started the job, I just dove into reading about Judaism, Jewish history, and just whatever I could get my hands on in terms of different Jewish traditions from around the world and throughout Jewish history. Just learning anything that I could about these many diverse Jewish communities that have existed and that continue to exist. When I tell people about my job and how I wound up here, and they ask me how I learned all this history behind the Judaica itself, I can honestly tell them that I learned all of that on the job, that I learned something new about Jewish history, Jewish culture every single day. I was just reading in preparation for a tour I'm giving next week about the Jewish communities of North Africa, and learning the histories behind those communities is something I've never looked into before. So there's always a surprise.
So when it came to your previous jobs, what did you take away from the successes and failures of using museum artifacts to educate people for this role now with the Michael Klein Collection? Like, how does that previous experience inform your approach now?
A lot of the work that I did at the local history museums before was with school groups. So K through 12, either creating curriculum pieces to be used in the classroom, or I also created a program, a hands-on history program that I would take into local classrooms. So I did a lot of work with little kids in those two jobs, leading tours of museums, guiding them through hands-on manipulation of objects and reproduction objects. So I learned a lot about the way that kids interact with stuff, with things, with objects, and the way that they learn from that tactile experience. At B'nai Jehudah, the audience that I have is a little bit different. I do work with the young audience a lot, but I also am working with an adult audience. And, the way that adults interact with objects is not all that different from the way little kids interact with objects. Adults love to get their hands on something special, on something shiny. They love to touch it. They love to learn secrets about it. They love to learn its history. They love to learn where it came from. They love to know what it's made of. They love to know who has used it. The audiences, they might look different and they might talk a little bit differently with, varying degrees of sophistication about the objects that they're encountering, but the interest is pretty consistent.
So to actually sort of get inside your process and your mind, given that difference, what is the difference between sort of creating educational content for kids versus, the adult programming in the collection? Like when you're actually constructing the curriculum, how do you do it? What are you looking out for in terms of the certain hooks for the object, for the different sort of age ranges and that kind of thing?
Mostly about the level of sophistication with which you can talk about an object. With kids, you have to use simple language and you talk about, simple concepts that they are already very familiar with. Those same lessons can still apply to adults. You're just able to do it with a broader range of language, personal experiences. A woman who I work with who's a local docent. She's a docent at the Nelson, and she's one of my terrific volunteers. She reminded me that at the Nelson, in their docent training, they talk about sticky knowledge, about how when you are learning something new, if you can stick that new piece of information to something that you already know, that you're building on top of something that you already have experience with, then that stickiness will help you to remember the new information. So adults just have a broader range of experiences that you can stick things to. With kids, they have a limited range and adults have a broader range. It's really just remembering that kids don't have those experiences to back up to stick that knowledge to, whereas adults, you can talk to them and have a dialogue about the histories that they already know and the concepts that they know, so that you can make connections. You can help to make connections between these new facts and the facts that they're already comfortable with.
And just a point of translation, can you just say briefly, what is a docent?
The docent is a museum term for a person who is essentially a tour guide within the museum space, a person who will guide you from artwork to artwork generally, because docents are usually found in art museums. The docent will be there to guide you through a series of works of art and help to frame a story linking all of those objects. And the best docents will create a dialogue between themselves and the people that are in their group that they're giving the tour to. The best docent training organizations, like the places that provide the best training for their docents, really encourage not just standing up and talking about a piece of art and explaining to people about art, but rather engaging with the work of art and the people taking the tour. So that's what a docent does. Here at B'nai Jehudah, I have a small core of volunteers who are performing much the same role, but we're not calling them docents. The word docent is really linked to the museum world, and the Klein Collection it's not a museum. The Klein Collection is an integral part of life here at B'nai Jehudah. I work with the rest of the staff to make objects in the Klein Collection part of life and part of daily life at B'nai Jehudah. So the guides here at the Klein Collection are providing much of the same experience as a docent would in a museum, but also helping to guide people through their learning about Jewish history and Jewish culture.
Awesome. So to come back to the educational piece as well, in terms of the programming you run, can you tell us about the Klein Collection Learning Group, the monthly discussion led by you? What kinds of things, are you learning about? What are you structuring it around?
I have been structuring it around a different theme every month. So in December, we talked about Hanukkah. It's Hanukkah. We're going to talk about Hanukkah Menorahs. In prior months, we have looked at Jewish amulets, and we've looked at objects for Rosh Hashanah. We looked at greeting cards. There's a whole subset of collectors who do nothing but collect Rosh Hashanah greeting cards. which is so cool. Really, what I do is I look for strengths in the collection. There are certain areas in the collection where we have a lot of examples of a particular thing. Like we have a lot of Hanukkah menorahs. We have a lot of etrog boxes, of highly decorated boxes to keep your etrog in for the length of Sukkot. We have a lot of these, usually they're made of silver amulets. They're protective, mystical pieces of silver, or sometimes they're written on pieces of parchment, and they provide this mystical protection for the person who is wearing or carrying it. So I select the subjects or the topics for each meeting based on strengths in the collection. Maybe it's just a grouping that I have been studying or reading about recently. That's what we're doing for next week. I'm leading a session on objects from North Africa, only because we have a bunch of these pieces and what they are varies. There's some amulets, there's some Torah ornaments, there's some garments. This one, I am really building this experience around a geographical area. So I just think about what in the collection I've been looking at recently and where it's got some strengths, and can usually pull together some research to give the attendees some good background information about them. It's also a good opportunity for the people who are training to be guides to get some resources for learning about Jewish history, Jewish culture. So I provide them with like photocopies of articles, academic articles, or articles from recent publications like news media. So I try to provide them with some things to take home and read for their own learning.
I'm also curious, my understanding is that the Michael Klein Collection includes some stuff from the history of B'nai Jehudah. What's something maybe notable about that part of the collection and how it speaks to the way the temple is tied into the history of Kansas City as a whole?
The permanent display here at B'nai Jehudah is made up of lots of objects from the Klein Collection, and it also includes several really standout objects from the temple's collection that precede Michael's gift. Some of them have been part of B'nai Jehudah for 50 years, for 100 years. One of the objects that people who come to B'nai Jehudah for the first time in a while, if they've been away because of COVID, or if maybe they were members, 40 years ago and now they're members again, one thing that they come and they see is when you walk in the front door at B'nai Jehudah, we have, in a recent renovation, reinstalled a large menorah sculpture in the front entryway of the building. And people who knew the B'nai Jehudah building from our former location at 69th and Holmes, they'll recognize this large menorah because it used to be on the bima at our former location. This is an emblem that is part of B'nai Jehudah, and it's become part of B'nai Jehudah's logo. So they'll see that large sculpture and they get excited. They get excited to see it. We also have other pieces that were part of that sanctuary, Torah ornaments and a Torah mantle that were commissioned for that sanctuary. So those are some pieces of B'nai Jehudah history, but also of Kansas City history, because the artist who designed those was a Kansas City-based architect. And he was commissioned to create these architectural and decorative elements for this, magnificent mid-century sanctuary.
So when you're looking at the collection as a whole, what's the most important lesson, do you think? I know this will be hard to boil down, but what's the most important lesson to take away from the collection itself, its diversity of artifacts and its existence, both for you and also what you hope people and kids understand from it?
The greatest lesson to take away from seeing this display of the Klein Collection is an appreciation for the great diversity of Jewish life that exists today and that has existed for centuries. That there is not just one way to be a Jew, and there's not just one tradition that you have to follow. There are traditions and customs that they're all rooted in the same source material, but they take different forms. So anybody who comes to see the collection and engage with the objects in the collection, they gain a little understanding of the many, many ways that Jews have been Jews throughout history, and learning about our differences and appreciating our differences. It's a value that I think we can always use more of.
So the last question I have for you is, what's your favorite part of the Kansas City Jewish community, especially since you've kind of re-entered the fold in this kind of I would say this big way. I mean, to be curator and educating with this collection is like a pretty amazing thing. So what's your favorite part of being in the community?
So coming back and being really integrated into the Kansas City Jewish community has been a lot of fun, because although when I was growing up, my family was involved in our synagogue. My mom was a cantorial soloist at the synagogue where I grew up. And so I always was there at services watching and listening to her sing. But really becoming part of this community again has reminded me about the great people that are part of it, the great people that are the makeup of the Kansas City Jewish community. You know, it's a small one, and we all know each other, of course. And I appreciate that more and more every single day. But they're great people. There's just so many terrific people who support one another. They support one another's projects and passions. They support each other's kids and their parents, each one another's parents. There is this very loving community here that I appreciate more and more all the time.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Abby, for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you.
The Getting to Know Jew podcast is a product of the Kansas City Jewish Chronicle and the Jewish Federation of Greater Kansas City. It is part of the Jewfolk Podcast Network and produced by Jewfolk Inc. Please rate, review, subscribe, and share. If you have suggestions for future guests, please email the show at webmaster@jewishkc.org.